semester. And I'm going to now reintroduce Dr. Dana Miranda, since I guess those of you online didn't hear my introduction earlier. So Dr. Miranda is an assistant professor of philosophy and a faculty fellow at the Applied Ethics Center here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He specializes in Africana philosophy, political philosophy, and psychosocial studies. And in addition, he currently serves as the Secretary of Digital Outreach and Chair of Architectonics for the Caribbean Philosophical Association and the co-director for Pixie Boston. His talk tonight is entitled Commemorative Conflict as an Encounter. Welcome, Dr. Miranda. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the tech mishaps.
So thank you everyone for joining us. It's not often you get introduced twice, so I take it as a compliment and I really appreciate the patience. Although we do have some extra time for folks that have class, I will still try to stick to the framework. Again, a lot of it for me is about Q&A and engagement as someone who works in this area about monuments and commemorative conflict, but as also someone who does a lot of dialogue work and facilitation. This is an area I'm very familiar with. I want to share any knowledge with you all, answer any questions you have, but I also want us to get better as a collective in dealing with these issues. So I really want to center the audience in this talk, but that said, I'm gonna put my PowerPoint. I'm gonna try to make sure people online can see it. Our screen should already be recorded. So just give me 1 second to get that set up. All right, so there we go. I was scared for just 1 second. So as noted, my talk is called Commemorative Conflict as an Encounter. And in particular, I will be talking about conflict and monuments through a particular structured dialogue model that I actually co-created when I was a graduate student at UConn. So between 2015, 2019, as a graduate student, I worked with other graduate students, other professors, other community members in Hartford, Connecticut, particularly the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is an art museum, the Connecticut Old State House, the Hartford Public Library, and it just kept on expanding. So moving from a Connecticut-based model to New England-based, we've done international encounters throughout the years. I've always been involved. I wanted to see how this particular model could actually be applied when it comes to conflict resolution. So I'm going to walk us through, again, what's the big deal with monuments, and then actually walk you through the encounters model while actually practicing it. So this is going to be a lot of hands-on activity from you all, but again, as a moderator, as a facilitator, I will walk us through this so you not only experience encounters, you would actually know how to do it yourself if this is something you want to do. So the first thing I'd like to do is, again, just introductions. So again, thank you, Professor Karen Ross, for the lovely 2 introductions. I also want to thank, again, the Conflict Resolution Colloquium for allowing me to actually present my work. And as always, I also want to acknowledge that the land we're actually on is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts First Nations. If we're speaking other places, this would still hold. And when we're talking about commemorative conflict, a lot of the issues usually people frame it as is that there are issues with Confederate statues, but that is only a snippet of the actual monumental fights that have been happening in this country for years. So a lot of it is actually around indigenous issues of sovereignty and the conflict therein. Whose land is this on? Who gets actually a share of public belonging or public memory? Now, as noted, commemorative conflict can also be a possibility of how can we engage with history, how can we engage with the public in a much more conducive atmosphere. If we are familiar, especially around 2016, 2018, when there's a lot of conflict about police brutality, Black Lives Matter was getting a lot of renewed support, that we had an incident in Charlottesville, Virginia, where because of a monument being possibly removed or torn down, We had March of the Right, as it's called, with tiki, I was gonna say pitchforks, tiki torches. And unfortunately, someone actually passed away during that incident. And so the operative question I have is, how through an encounters model can we ask that salient question at the bottom of the PowerPoint? Namely, why do people argue, fight, and even die over what belongs in the public sphere? To get at that, of course, there are different perspectives about what a particular monument can mean and particular attitudes towards the monument. So usually it's framed as a two-sided battle. There are those who want to preserve and there are those that want to remove. These, of course, have different names, different practices. So some of them deal with police brutality, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, that some monuments, because of what they represent and because of what their histories are, they should be removed from the public sphere. And there are also preservationists who seem to retain that history. So some of us might find that problematic because what are you trying to retain? Is it issues of domineering power? Is it heritage? Again, the refrain, it's heritage, not hate. Some people use the slippery slope argument that if you tear down one monument to a person with a problematic history, they all must come down because who of us is untouched, unclean? All in all, though, if we're just to simplify some of these positions to what should be done about monuments, should we remove some? Should we re-signify? Again, give them a different meaning. Sometimes that means amending a plaque with more accurate information or different histories. Sometimes it means rethinking what a monument actually looks like. How can we actually engage? Is it just a background infrastructure? Or is it something that people can engage with, play with, decorate? You could also retain it. So this is a preservationist model that the status quo, leave things as they are, but instead you can construct new monuments. Sometimes they can even speak to one another. So there have been very famous cases where you have a monument to a Confederate leader, and then you construct a new monument directly across from it to try to, again, speak to history, that the Confederacy was part of the United States, again, for only a small number of years. But what did the Confederacy represent? And the new monument is putting down modern day or present day concerns and meanings and values into the public. Now, normally, again, because these battles are pitted, there are only two sides. Are you gonna remove these problematic monuments or are you gonna preserve them? That framework can get very heated and lead to a lot of debate. And in my next slide, I'll actually show you one framework. So taking a Boston monument, let me give you some information. Again, I'm just gonna assume many of us aren't trained historians about this particular monument in question. You might know some things, but you don't know the entire history from construction or really the imagination of the monument, construction of it, and the history to the present day. Because when most people engage with monuments, when you think of it as only having two sides, and not that monuments are multidimensional, that they have numerous histories within them, that both government officials and the people around them can use it for their own particular purposes. There might be political issues, ethical issues. You might have questions of aesthetics. Is that statue beautiful or not? If monuments actually encapsulate so many different types of meanings, then it's never a simple binary decision. It's not simply a binary debate, but it's often framed that way. So I'm going to provide you with that framing. And so after you see the next slide, ask yourself, what should be done? Do we have to disagree, have a conversation about these monuments? Do we have to fight about these monuments? Would you die for these monuments? Again, some people are shaking their heads no. Perfectly fine. But again, some people are willing to do all three. And so what should be done? Remove, retain, resignify. Again, just keep some of these key terms for when we actually look. And so with that prepping, sorry. Okay.
I'm not sure. if that's-
Me. 1 second, sorry. Zoom. So let me see if I can share that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. We can see it.
Okay. So I apologize for that. Okay. So the screen looks a little bit different than what I'm seeing, so I'll try to navigate. Let me see. So for the people online, can you see this next slide?
Nope, you're still on your first slide.
Okay, so let me. See. So that moves that one. So I think I figured it out now. So we should all be on the first screen. I'm just gonna move using these tools. All right. Does everyone see the second screen online? With
No.
introduction.
No, it's still on the first screen.
Thank you. I'll see if I can figure this out. So let me try this.
Share your slideshow if you're doing this.
No, I did. It wouldn't go through.
If you save as a PDF and share it. I can. Whatever.
Yeah, no, do what you have to do. Yeah, thank you for your patience.
Sure, is when you share like this.
Okay.
Actually, here's a PDF. Okay.
Yeah, it PowerPoint shut down like twice. Is this your laptop?
No, it's not mine. My laptop.
There you go. Then when you share this, it should just like picture. Okay? So go back and share. And, hopefully there you go.
All right. Again, thank you for your double patience. For people online, can you see the first screen?
Yes.
Okay. Again, we apologize for the significant amount of delays, but thank you guys for still being on. I'm gonna try to quickly walk us through the first two slides, so we can just get to the activity. I know you guys were listening, but now you actually be able to see what I was referring to. So again, the first slide is just introduction. Thank you, my land acknowledgement, the place we're all gathered here today. And I just wanted to note that commemorative conflict regarding monuments and memory and public history and belonging can not only be a source of, again, great disagreement, even death, but can also be an opportunity for the ways in which we can reframe what it actually means to belong to history, what it means to belong in public. And so the operative question I, again, just wanted everyone to think about for this presentation was, why do people argue, fight, and even die over what belongs in the public sphere? So again, I know I'm going quickly through, but again, why do people argue, fight, and even die over what belongs in the public sphere? And then just framing the two different perspectives, one more removal model, or what we call deaccession, also in the artwork, removing things from public that no longer have a space. Usually they're framed against protests against racism, particularly anti-Black racism, police brutality, settler colonialism, white supremacy. This happens throughout the world, not only the United States. My presentation will be a US focus, just to keep things simple, but in the Q&A I can talk about different places and how they've engaged with history. But there's also many preservationists who seem to retain models for both problematic reasons, but also for historical arguments, about those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. So what does it mean to retain something in public without endorsing? Is that possible? Those are numerous historical questions and debates, but they're also happening in public. And so as I introduce the next slide, so what's the actual example I'm giving you all to engage with? Just the questions I think we should think of: what should be done? Removal, resignification, retention, construction. And for those just joining us, resignification just means amendment. So this means you can add a plaque, you can change the information on plaque. Sometimes you can, again, change what the monument means by playing with it, engaging with it, redecorating it, moving it to a different place. So again, not removal from the public itself, but removals to different publics. So resignification is quite broad. Now that we have both the people in front of me and the people online on the same wavelength, the same place, I just want to, again, give you an example where most of us don't have the full history, the full information, but I'm asking you to make a decision now. What would you do with this monument in question? Would you argue with others, fight with others? Would you die to change what belongs in public? So the example I wanted to give, again, just brief snapshots. We have Faneuil Hall, again, a Boston memorial, Boston monument for many people. It was nicknamed the Cradle of Liberty due to its role in both the American Revolution, but also it had a lot of abolitionists, slavery abolitionists who would speak. Frederick Douglass spoke there numerous times. This was a meeting ground to engage with the question of liberty. Liberty as a country, liberty for individuals. Again, very famous Boston monument. But what most people don't know is that Peter Faneuil, the namesake for Faneuil Hall, actually was a slave owner. And so a lot of the money in which he donated to construct Faneuil Hall came from the slave trade of African people. And because, again, this wasn't just known retroactively. It's not historians looking in the 20th or 21st century saying, we've uncovered a new secret about Peter Faneuil. Rather, even during his time period, William Lloyd Garrison gave it a different nickname. And I don't know if you guys can see it on the screen, but he called it at different points the cradle of death. Because for many people in that time period, and now people are relooking at the conversation, what does it mean to have his name attached to liberty when he's also engaged with the practice of selling people? So again, it was known during that time period, and people are relearning that now. And so one thing that many people have done, particularly with New Democracy Coalition, let's see if I can move this so you guys can see a little bit better, that the New Democracy Coalition asked or brought forth a position that instead of keeping the name Faneuil Hall, we should rename it. In particular, a very popular decision, not only from the New Democracy Coalition, but they did a polling, they asked for positions in the community, was Crispus Attucks. So Crispus Attucks was of mixed descent, both African-American and indigenous. The history of his origin, though, of what indigenous tribe, that gets a little hazy for folks. But during the actual time period, during the newspapers, they always refer to him as mulatto, and would either reference him as being Native American or African American. But during the Boston Massacre, he was claimed to be the first person to die. And so usually the refrain is Crispus Attucks was the first person to die for the revolution, for liberty. Now, again, Faneuil Hall's name has not been changed. There's been proposals, there's been debates for 5-10 years to change its name. It doesn't have wide traction. But with that just snippet of information, that you could give it a different name for someone who also represented liberty, that had a historical Boston connection. What do you do with Faneuil Hall? What do you guys think? Should we replace its name? So we got some head nods. So who would want to retain? Let me see if I can engage in chat too. Perfect. So Isabel is part of NDC and they campaigned to change its name. So we have someone already taking a stake on this issue. Now, when it comes to Faneuil Hall, it hasn't reached the same salience levels of the Confederate statue. Again, people weren't rallying on different sides. People weren't dying on the streets or trying to, again, tear down Faneuil Hall or paint Chris's Attucks name on the other side. So one thing I do in my work on monuments is to say that most monuments remain cold until they get hot. That you can keep them in the background, you can see a pigeon on it, you don't have to care about it at all. It's just part of your daily infrastructure. I go about the city, it has a crosswalk, it has a street sign, it has that monument to some person in the past, and it has numerous ones. But if someone just stops and looks and says, "Whoa, who's this person enough that they're important to have their name etched in stone, to have a monument, a statue built in their name?" Once someone does that historical work, that archival work of saying, what actually is my public? What am I being surrounded with? What's the norm? Is it just historical? Is it endorsement from the government? Then that cold monument can all of a sudden become hot. Again, Confederate statues remained in place for 50 to 100 years in many places. For many people nationally, these were cold monuments. They were there, you might see them on a trip, but people weren't dying over whether they should stay in place or not. Now, that doesn't mean that Black people in particular weren't protesting Confederate monuments ever since their creation. Frederick Douglass, W. Du Bois, again, have very famous statements disagreeing that Robert E. Lee should have a statue in Virginia, for instance. There's well-documented histories of people saying this person does not deserve a place in public memory. But if you have the capital, if you have organizational support, if you donate, which many monuments are just donated to the government, and the government is responsible for then upkeeping it and maintaining it. So you get a free statue, and now you have to keep it there and maintain it for its duration. Faneuil Hall can become a hot monument. There can be mass disagreement if people rally against it, if they have a suitable replacement. Again, from Mayor Michelle Wu to certain governor, they've all engaged in conversations. And the normal response is, we hear the community, we hear what you're saying, we're gonna hold a panel, we're gonna convene a panel, we're gonna get the full history, and then we'll come to a decision. And that decision is usually months to years later and saying, okay, it's died down. The disagreement's over, it's cold again. We don't actually have to do anything. This can keep on occurring, but as long as you don't actually address the root cause, should Faneuil Hall actually have a namesake? You're not tearing down the actual hall. That's never been a proposal. But you're saying the namesake should be removed, should be torn down, and replaced with a suitable target whose memories should be invoked in public. So if you haven't heard any of the debates and you've lived in Boston, worked in Boston, know that this might still become a live issue. Like when Yawkey Way was a proposed change because of, again, the owner, Yawkey of the Red Sox, racism. But if we're even going a step further, if you think of Charlottesville, Virginia, and the Robert E. Lee statue, people are willing to die because of monuments. And what I hope to do, particularly in the Q&A, is give you more examples of how historically this has happened, but also globally it's happening right now. People are dying to keep monuments, people are dying to remove them. And I know it can blow people's minds, but hopefully through this presentation, you see that monuments are key sites of contention and therefore can also be key sites of conflict resolution. Because monuments don't simply represent histories, they also represent the present and people's relationships and power. And so they can be a way to engage with others and say, okay, how do we have a full representation of history? How do we engage with one another? What actually belongs in public? Can we do it democratically, or is it going to be done under the cover of night? Either way, the decision usually gets made. And so in order to show that, I actually want to walk you to a very condensed version of the encounters model. So usually when I work with my community partners and I say, what does your community actually talk about? What concerns do they have? Well, during 2020 in Connecticut, monuments became a central concern for folks. People wanted to understand why do people care so much about it? What should we do in Connecticut? What monuments should we create in Connecticut? And so again, this is a very condensed version where I'm going to walk you through the model. There will be a question period that I'll ask you guys. Whoever feels comfortable, how would you answer that question? How would you engage in dialogue with one another? I'm only going to do that twice. One's going to be a written version, one's going to be a video version, because you can use anything as a source material to gather people together to talk about monuments, to talk about these issues. So Encounters is a forum for public discussion, and what we'll be doing in a very condensed version is going through 3 rounds, an open forum, a takeaway, and social debrief section to just show you what I actually do with folks when I talk about monuments or when I do conflict resolution using structured dialogue. So again, we call them rounds. So instead of battling, instead of being in a boxing ring, these are dialogic rounds. So you're going to be exposed to different dialogue formats and prompts to engage people's relationships with one another through open-ended questions. So can we actually speak about this issue in terms of like learning and humility? So again, round 1 is a welcome, where I'd like, hi, my name is Dr. Dana Francisco Miranda. I would usually say how I'm actually situated, whether it's in Massachusetts, whether it's Connecticut, but I'd welcome you to having this conversation. So you guys all chose to be here to hear about monuments, conflict, and dialogue. Thank you for coming. You would introduce yourselves either in small tables or in breakout rooms. So we have an online model as well. And then when you're in those separate rooms, a facilitator would walk you through the next round. Okay? So round 1 is done. We welcomed each other. Great. We did that quickly. But as your moderator, I also want us to have certain table rules of how we actually dialogue and discuss with one another. So being honest, listening is just as important as talking. So for the first round that I'm going to give you, or really the second round, it's a timed model. I use my phone, and each person has actual time, 1 to 2 minutes to actually just speak. And so if you're with 5 people, that means for 8 minutes you're listening and only 2 minutes you're talking. So how do we start off the conversation? We're stressing the importance of listening. That it's not a debate where you're trying to argue your point, but you're trying to get a sense of another person's perspective. And the questions are just leading us there. The second one, which has a video, is what we call more open-ended, where we have 10 minutes as a collective to speak, and the facilitator's in charge of making sure everyone speaks. But again, it's a little less structured at that moment. When we also have these dialogues, we say use I statements. Don't speak for groups or people. You're only representing yourself in these conversations. What's your perspective? Even if we have some similarities, I might have a different perspective than you. Again, this is not a debate. It's about open and honest engagement about the issue, the question that we're concerned about. And again, if you're online, please have your camera turned on. You don't need this one if you're in person. We also say that because these are points of conflict, you can criticize ideas, criticize positions, but not the person. Don't say, how could you, like, you're the worst person for believing that. Because we all know that shuts down conversation. But you're also admitting that at the end of the day, we can leave this conversation with our own distinct position. And that's perfectly fine under Encounters model. That we're trying to get more knowledge of how to engage with one another while also not rejecting that engagement. Last but not least, there are 2, honor the time. So again, the timekeeper, listen to me. Also honor other people's times when they speak and confidentiality. We just hold that instead of pure anonymity, where you don't share anything after this is done, if you do want to share someone's story, someone's information at your table, at your breakout room, you just get their permission and you try to make their details as anonymous as possible. So the lesson, the story is shared, but the person's identity isn't. So again, these table rules are read at every single encounter, and we've done over 40 since 2016. Now that you have the table rule, now we jump straight into round 2. So this is part of the encounters I actually did for the Connecticut Monument one. And so what everyone has are readings beforehand. We always share free and public readings or videos with folks. And we also leave time to take quotations or small snippets of video themselves so people can actually look at it first, take 2 minutes to read. I'll read out loud for folks. And then just think about what these paragraphs actually invoke. So this is a question of, should we erect a monument to George Washington? And this is the monument in DC, the George Washington Monument. Again, it's the obelisk, the white obelisk. So we know it is created, but that doesn't mean we know the history of how it was created and why there was a huge debate of whether it should be created or not. So I'll just quickly read through these. And for those who don't know, Mr. Henry Lee and Mr. Nathaniel Macon are senators. So this is a senatorial debate about allocating funds to create a public national monument. So at the end of this debate, they noted, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that a mausoleum of American granite and marble in a pyramidal form, 100 feet square at the base and of proportionate height, shall be erected in testimony of the love and gratitude of the citizens of the United States to George Washington. Once this amendment was approved, there is a debate of, do we want a mausoleum? Do we want it in a pyramidal form? Should there actually be a monument to someone who's living? Again, Washington was living at the time, and many people were worried that if you create a monument to Washington, even though he's a huge American figure, that you would be deifying him, that you would be making him or giving him the same significance as King George III, which again was the cause of the American Revolution to begin with. So we had 2 different perspectives inside. Mr. Henry Lee notes, the grandeur of the pile we wish to raise will impress a sublime awe on all who behold it. It will survive the present generation. It will receive the homage of our children's children, and they will learn that the truest way to gain honor amidst a free people is to be useful, to be virtuous. This is a pro-argument, that this monument should be constructed. On the other hand, Mr. Macon writes, before gentlemen act in this business, let them look to Egypt. There they will behold precedents in profusion. Men made gods and statues and monuments and mausolea, covering the whole face of the country. But where will they find the virtues of the talents or the talents of the men they were meant to commemorate? Now is the time to make a stand against this monumental mania. Even for the first president, even for George Washington, for Macon and many, it wasn't just him debating at the time. Many people saw creating monuments to the living as a set of deification, as a mania, that what you're honoring actually will lead to, again, worse public value. And I'm using George Washington here out of the numerous encounters I've done on monuments, because when people think of the monuments debate in the present, they usually think of 2 models. You're either thinking of the Confederates in the United States, or you're thinking of Fallism in South Africa. So it's either the Confederacy and white supremacy and the relationship to Black people in particular, or in South Africa, relationships to English colonialism. But when I say monuments are supremely important, it's okay, take a central figure. when it comes to George Washington, the reason why some people don't even want to remove Confederate statues is because, okay, if Robert E. Lee doesn't belong in public because of his public treason, who again isn't untouched by something uncomely? George Washington. Well, for some of us in the room, what was his relationship to his enslaved people because he was a slave owner? Many people say, well, he set all of them free. Well, not own a judge who ran away. He kept hunting her until he died because she dared to free herself. So own a judge, Judge Washington. Again, if you're familiar with that story. Or what is George Washington's relationship with many indigenous people, particularly in New York? When he stopped the rebellion by committing or allowing his generals to commit massacre, and then they sowed salt in the land based on his command. That sow the land in salt so they can't even grow, they can't even live here because they dared to oppose us. So when it comes to George Washington, again, whose histories matter? What are you actually thinking about when you see the George Washington Monument, that huge obelisk? Many people worry that if you take down or remove one instance, then everything has to come down. And then what is our public history? Who can belong in public? But again, if you were just in the encounters with me, I would read these aloud because many of the people that come in are either younger students or senior citizens. And so again, having them read something from a screen, we found out doesn't work. You have to also communicate and speak it out loud. After those 2 minutes though, I was like, okay, we had some questions that we actually created with our partner. So the 2 questions we asked after people read the excerpts, after they looked at those small quotations again, were why do you think the vote to approve of the Washington Monument was so contentious? Did this surprise you? And secondly, what were the potential benefits for American democracy of erecting a monument to George Washington? What are some of the possible consequences? So monuments are always constructed. Why is that construction contentious? So again, I'm not gonna, for the sake of time, because we've had so many hiccups, I'm not gonna give the full 2 minutes of silence. You've already been in silence long enough today. But here, this is where you allow space in a small gathering of people where they just know each other's name. They just know that they're interested in the same subject. They just know that they read the same things together. To just have a conversation about this question and about monuments. And again, you're only speaking for 2 minutes, you're listening for 8. For us, it's about saying one person isn't monopolizing the space, even if they're a historian, even if they're very knowledgeable. I'm trying to learn from others about, even for George Washington, should he have a space in US history? Should he belong in public? Many people say Peter Faneuil, yes, he was a slave owner, but his hall is associated with his name, and many people went to that hall and fought in the name of liberty and fought in the name of slave abolition. So he should remain. In answering these questions, again, it's not a debate, but it's just trying to actually uncover what the other person is actually thinking. What is their relationship to monuments? Are they learning something new as well? Maybe they thought George Washington was a central figure that had no blemishes. And now through this conversation, they're discovering some dark spots in history. This third round is when we started opening up. So instead of 2 minutes each person, it's just 10 minutes for the total round. And we'd have another one. Again, this is a 2-hour dialogue, so I'm condensing it. But we can also use videos. So I'm gonna try to play the video. I'm gonna try to see if it'll work online as well. But I play the video, you have some time to digest it, and then I'll present you with questions again. And here, again, I do want to play the video because I think it's important for understanding, again, how deep these contentions actually go via monuments. So I don't, is this the,
Point, you should be able to-
okay. Thank you. Just get it ready. This is. Yep, you can do whatever you need to do to make it work. Thank you. Because you can play inside as well.
Sharing the slide, but let's see. Thank you.
So what I'm gonna do for the people in the chat is, let's see. See if I can put in the chat so they can just watch it on their end. Okay, so yes, this should work just because with screen sharing. You guys in the that are online can just watch it there, and I can just play this here. See if it works this way. So sorry, folks. This isn't my computer. I'll just see if I can do it one last time. Okay, so I'll just keep it small. So again, that video was taken around 2020 during the same time this monument encounter was first being given in Connecticut. And as you saw, just in terms of sheer numbers of 68 removals, almost 70 removals, but there's 718 Confederate statues, Confederate memorials still in the United States. And actually, there's been new research that shows that the first count that you were given was actually inaccurate. There are more Confederate statues. So there's still around 800 Confederate statues. And that's just one area of contention. If you did Mount Rushmore, again, with 4 presidential faces on it, and you learn the history that actually this was called the 6 grandfathers, and the Sioux, according to legal documents, they're always called the Sioux Nation. The Seti-Saquon people, though, actually had a treaty with the US government that said the 6 grandfathers would be their land in perpetuity. The US broke that treaty because gold was discovered in the Black Hills. And even this issue of land, this issue of a monument went all the way to the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court issuing a statement that said, yes, this is a breaking of a treaty. It was illegal, it was theft. And because the US government stole from you and made it federal land, we want to, again, compensate you. We want to pay you $8 billion at the time for your land. And the Seti-Saquon people said, this isn't about a payment. That land is sacred ground. It has a relationship. That is a sacred mountain that was desecrated by you carving presidential faces in it. And so even with that Supreme Court ruling saying it was a theft, it was a broken treaty, the US government refuses to give that land back. And so when you're talking about monumental debates, it's not simply Confederate statues. It's also George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. It's also Mount Rushmore. That once you start diving into monuments and how much they actually are in this country, and how much conflict that they can actually bring. Faneuil Hall. Again, that can become a heated moment that engages you and your community members a lot more. And as you saw from the video, like Faneuil Hall, as much as we talk about it, again, I like the work done by the New Democracy Coalition. They've done protests at Faneuil Hall. They poured red paint to mimic, again, blood. But again, compared to what we just saw in that video, it's much tamer. But that doesn't mean because it's tamed once that it won't ever explode. And if you're worried about the explosion, the monumental explosions that can actually happen due to these sites, then for us, encounters is a way of actually acknowledging that monuments do matter to people. Some people will die for a monument. We need to actually understand why monuments, why public belonging and public history matters to folks. Because once you connect with a monument to, again, hey, Robert E. Lee is not simply representing the Confederacy, he's representing slavery, he's representing anti-Black racism to folks, he's representing, again, modern day discrimination and people having to live under the shadow of that monument, where they see a continuation of systems. Then you realize a lot of the debates about monuments is not simply a debate about history in the past. It's usually a debate about present day relations. But most people don't like to talk about present day issues without that conflict. But by reading together and learning together, then you can at least encounter one another, encounter conversations, encounter dialogue, where people can still share their opinions and views, but it's about engaging with one another. That, yes, this matters to the both of us. This isn't going to be settled through one conversation, but we need numerous engagements. We need numerous ways of actually interacting with one another. And even if we decide on differing points, I want a removal, you want to retain it, we have a better understanding of one another where it's not a binary decision. It's not Manichaean, you're right or wrong. You're good, you're evil. And so, as I just try to navigate back to this, the questions, and again, I hope people online that you can also follow, I shared my screen. So we should be on round 3, the dialogue question. After playing that video, these were the questions, again, my community collaborators decided on. Even though I'm a specialist in this area, it's not about my knowledge and what I want people to think of. It's what the community of Hartford actually cared about. So do you think there's a relationship between monuments and white supremacy? How are people defining white supremacy? What monuments in question? Is it the far right? Is it neo-Nazis? Is it the US government? What are you actually talking about when you say white supremacy? Is it George Washington? Even though people might have differing views of what white supremacy looks like, you can still talk to one another because you're sharing a common video, a common source to begin that conversation. And then secondly, how might memorials and monuments help shape a better understanding of the past or shape the future? Then now, again, this would be a 2-hour dialogue. Now that we've seen just how much monuments actually matter to folks, that it actually does help shape our relationship to the past and what we know. It can also shape what we want to build in the future. What new monuments will we create? What do you think belongs in public? What do you think you want represented, as one senator said, for your children's children? Public belonging, public, what I call infrastructure. The key for looking at commemorative conflict is, again, what belongs in public. Because what doesn't belong in public is often in the shadows and is, to be honest, is often underlooked, exploited, dominated, can lead to further hurt. Now, after that dialogue round, the community members always create a reflection question where we share it on the screen like this. We also have a couple of handouts that also have this question to say, we can't talk about everything in 2 hours, but the community of Hartford wants you to think about this question moving forward. So we never answer it. We don't save time. It's just, again, I'll read it out loud for folks. I'm not going to do it here. But again, public spaces matter. Can you think about it more deeply? So this is shared with folks. And lastly, because we're always not as individuals, but at tables or in breakout rooms, we say instead of just making it individually based now, we went from a community to individual. It's not simply about the question you're interested in, but in your small table, in your small breakout room, what question would you want to ask? What question about monuments, about commemorative conflict are you most interested in? Now, during today's Q&A, we're not going to have time to practice it, but this is based on the right question formulation. There's also an organization that helps actually teach people how to create right questions or questions that lead to where you actually want to go. But for here, just think about the Q&A. What are you still interested in about? And as they're actually debating what they want to do, you'll always see, because I've done this numerous times, that instead of it being about your question, people are much more amenable to saying, oh, what are you interested in? What do you care? Oh, that's a great question. They always uplift each other. And because if I'm a facilitator, I cheat, I just combine people's questions. I say, okay, this is this one large question with subpoint A, subpoint B. But again, they have fun actually asking questions and know that you can do it collectively. They might not have the answer, but they're willing to ask the question together. And once they do that, because a lot of academics and specialists are involved in it, we invite people to do an open forum. So if you're in those small tables or breakout rooms, what you wouldn't know, because you only know a person's name, you don't know their title, their relationship, is that we actually make the specialists engage in the tables the entire time. They're reading the same thing the audience is. They're asking the same questions for those 2 minutes. They're just speaking their piece and then listening for 8. It's not about one person having all the knowledge and I just need to impart it to it, memorize it. That we invite the specialists who are in those groups up and they get to answer those questions together. So this structured dialogue model is a mixed model. It's a mix between like a faculty presentation and a big community dialogue. The best of both worlds. You get the specialist knowledge at the end, but you're also speaking to a specialist the entire time as an equal. That history, these conversations also can matter to you. And you also have a say in what belongs in public. Can we do it as a collective and as a community? And so because we're at 6:46 and I still, again, want people to get to their classes, want to have time, I just want to say I'm going to share this with Professor Ross. So if you want to be interested in the takeaways, what we want people to take from every single encounter, I will share this with folks. Actively listen and reflect. For me, my favorite one is just rinse and repeat. If these things actually matter to you and you want to engage with folks, you can't just have one symposium, one colloquium once and say, okay, we're good. You got to be willing and committed to keep having these dialogues with folks. And so again, just for the sake of time, I will share this with folks so they can have the full takeaway list and just go to the Q&A. So again, I always lead my Q&As with a particular quote that always stands out for me. And so from Robert Lowe, he writes, "Their monuments stick like a fishbone in the city's throat." And he's talking about a Boston monument. He's talking about the Robert Booth Shaw monument. So again, if anyone's interested, for the Union Dead, it's about a Boston monument. And this quote always stuck out to me. But again, thank you guys for your patience dealing with technology writ large. I'm very interested in answering any questions, just communicating and engaging with you all. So thank you. And I'll just keep the chat up just in case there are questions there. Yeah.
It was very interesting. I've only gone to a few colloquiums, so this is, I think this is one of the best ones I've been to.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for coming. I think it really made me think, and if you can have strong opinions, but then it also makes you think on a more logical side, or try and just draw a very interesting and something that allows us to think about it, because this is our public space when we want for our future. So
Thank you. Appreciate it. Daniel, questions about encounters or like monuments, like any monuments you're interested about? Yeah.
Abby, you mentioned earlier that you've done this model for like international stages as well. I'm just curious like how that went and if you did it a little differently, like if they kind of look at monuments.
So there are two different ways that we've done it internationally so far, and we're always looking to expand and teach people the model. Like we're not trying to hold on to it. You don't need a certificate and pay money for us. We're like, you want to do it. This is everything you need. Do it in your community, share it with whoever. But the two ways we've done it was more at an international conference. And so a lot of people, we allowed them to actually pick their topic together as a collective. And then I created, based on that, an encounter structure. And so then because there are more practitioners, we went like, okay, this is what I created based on everything you said, based on your diverse international interests. How can we improve upon it, tweak on it? What would you make? What edit? Who would you invite as a specialist? That was more like the training of how to, while doing it. The other one is when COVID hit and we're like, okay, we've done these dialogues for so many years in public. Are we just going to cancel it? Is the community going to think we're no longer interested in them or that we've gone away? Because again, universities have that habit. You do research and then you leave. And then the community's like, were you really about the community or were you about your research? So what we did, we just shifted everything online. And so the best international one we've done was on encounters on hip hop. So the origins of hip hop. We broadcasted it widely. We still had our Connecticut folks. We had people from Massachusetts, DC, Baltimore. And I was like, okay, I think it's just, we're very northeastern, East Coast based. We got a lot of people for some reason from Canada, as well as Europe. And I'm like, with the time difference, they're like, yeah, I'm tired, but I'm here. I want to talk about hip hop. And so we found like, if you really have a great topic that interests people, like it's not super local, like an Encounters on Faneuil Hall, probably is going to be very Boston based. But our model, we've done things on alchemy, we've done things like whatever the community is actually interested with. And because we partner with the museum, whenever they have a new artist exhibit, we did something about that. So when they had one on H.G. Moore and billionaires, we were like, okay, let's do an Encounters on wealth. So the model is very flexible. It's not simply about conflict. But I've used, because in my own personal research on monuments, I've been interested in seeing like how it can help in that vein. Do people feel like they're engaging more, even if they have the same position? So do you want to tear down monuments? Do you want to remove them? Do you see the other people's arguments? How committed? And in philosophy, like it's called epistemic humility. Like when we did our encounters on the Second Amendment, there are people that are like, I'm a Second Amendment right to bear arms person. And then one of the readings was just the Second Amendment. And they're like, oh, I didn't actually know it said that. So that was a moment where someone really fully committed to something actually had a sense of being humbled, not because of being lectured at, but because they were actually just engaging with material and speaking to other people. Like, did they really mean you should have an AK-47, or did it mean you can have a musket and a musket ball? And to like, what does the Second Amendment actually mean to folks? So we've done one on gun controls, like I'm just saying the other ones about conflict, climate change. So you can go from conflict to just like interest. You want to learn about alchemy? Sure. You want to learn about witchcraft? Sure, we've done that. So those are the more international ones. And I did see another hand, I think, briefly. Did you have your hand up? Yes.
My name is
Christina.
Christina. So I was about to ask the same question as Gabby did.
Okay.
To say a little bit more about the encounter model and how it's used in international context, but you've answered most of my questions.
Well, the one thing I'd add is that because I'm going to share this PowerPoint with folks, and you can share it afterwards, I'm perfectly fine with that, is that I'm part of a contested history initiative project with Beyond Conflict, and they're located in Boston. And again, from the title Beyond Conflict, they're all about conflict resolution. And so we've been partnered up to talk about monuments, and me and my colleague Nur actually created a white paper that just was released last month to give people more information about the meaning of monuments, the different ways you can approach monuments, a lot of like the fallacies or arguments people make about monuments, that monuments are history. We're trying to provide people with key feedback. So this is a 5-year project with the white paper now being released. What I want to do with the encounters model is start having encounters about monuments at local places nationally, but also internationally, to give people the tool sets to say, like, you know your community best. Especially, like, I love traveling, but you don't need me to actually do this with folks that you're in community with. So that's what we're trying to expand upon.
So my question was, you talked about the encounters model, and you mentioned a really good point about debates about monuments are often not about the past, but very much about the present dynamics and relationships that are continued to, still like very much probably sort of like cause debates and conflict in people today. And so I was just wondering, from the model, do you ever find, like, do the conversations ever result in, and I don't want to use the word solutions, but maybe compromises that are not necessarily based in sort of whether or not a decision is made about the erection of a monument or the pulling one down, but more concrete or maybe more material changes in surrounding communities. So, for example, one of the things that stands out to me about the debate surrounding around naming of Faneuil Hall
Mhm.
has a lot to do with the continued invisibility of Black people historically on the city's landscape, but also in terms of, just the continued issues with wealth gaps, for example. And so in addition to, sort of recognizing that the name change is not just about recognizing Black's presence, but it's also to get people to think about the ways in which Northern involvement in the slave trade also helps to contribute to that wealth gap. Have there been any other sort of possible programs that have said, okay, well, if we change the name, there'll also be, efforts to result in more affordable housing or something along those lines? Like, how do those conversations end up further inspiring or maybe serving as a catalyst for other more material, sort of like changes, perhaps?
And to take your example, one of the original monuments encounters that we did dealt with the EJI Slave Museum. And one of the conversations that erupted from that was not simply that some monuments need to be removed or possibly be removed, that also new monuments need to be created. And we have to think about what it would actually mean to represent histories and presence. And so there I found the conversation tended to more, once you go more to like what can be constructed, people started envisioning like, okay, this history also has a present, and how can we make space for those present issues? But I also think like another one that we've done that's Boston based is if anyone's ever been to the Christopher Columbus waterfront park, it's right across from like a Joe's Grill. But during 2019 and also 2020, it was like defaced and then its head was chopped off. And so that led to a conversation at the governmental level about one, many people in the Friends of Christopher Columbus, which is an Italian American League, wanted something representing Italian American history. But a lot of indigenous people saw Christopher Columbus, even in his time period, as being violent, as being a rapist, as committing massacres. And so a lot of the government officials were trying to say, how can we have a monument that actually envelops those two histories? The solution was to box it up and say, okay, we're removing it from the public, but we're gonna have these conversations until what's decided. But what typically happens, like those 68 monuments that were removed from the Confederacy, many of them were just placed in storage with the plans of putting them in a different public space. They weren't actually removed and torn down. They're like, okay, let's remove it and put it in a museum. Let's remove it and put it in a cemetery to soldiers. A lot of it wasn't an actual engagement with the operative question at what belongs in public. It was, let's wait until the disagreements stop and then we can continue business as usual. And so for me, what I want the encounters model, but also like my work on monuments to be is like, if we shift our understanding from history to the present and what we want in the future, then we have to have those conversations about not just what the Confederates did, but what the US government did, what the US government is currently doing. I want to connect monuments to, again, social structures, political structure. If your government, Boston government, federal government, has to maintain these monuments, that's a direct political connection for me to say, like, how do we move from simple concerns about just this monument to how these monuments are embedded in these political structures? I say a lot of it is about changing people's thinking so far, but there are numerous people that see the connection and then like, it's like, oh, what protest group can I join? What, like, when I presented like, oh, this person tore down a monument, this group, they're like, how do I get in contact? I'm like, I don't know everyone. I told you the group, you just find their webpage. So that's what I've seen happen for some folks. I saw him, yeah.
Thank you so much. Really, really taking into consideration and might have for the use of this kind kind of the dialogue and confrontation. I would have a lot of questions that I think we could reach out to later, but the one main thing I asked is, why is, putting something in a box and moving it to, maybe a history museum where there is a guided or curated way of teaching the history, or putting it in a set, why is that not a solution or not dealing with it? My question is really about timing and about expectations for change, especially around, very deeply embedded social issues and social structures that were not built in a day and likely will not be, changed in a day. And also the fact that there are many, many parties at, oftentimes that's why things get solved, right?
Yep.
So I'm not always convinced that like timing is just to wait till things tie over, but that there's a need to actually engage people and be thoughtful around it, because it's not just the monument itself, it's a lot of things, again, the economic system, like, and to mesh them almost gets nowhere, within, I think, within these cities. So again, this balance or thinking about it. So my actual question, I guess, is, are there maybe other options, right, that might emerge from your encounters work that maybe you didn't envision in the first place, or again, I think with the community work, it's very unlikely that getting people together, they might not know each other, right?
Yeah.
Like it's unlikely that the first name, would happen in a local forum, or also unlikely that, just watching the same 2-minute clip is going to ask people to really truly check their biases. So these are the kinds of things that I'm wondering how you deal with some of the bigger issues, things that are just all over the place.
Yeah, so
Or maybe that's not the goal.
no, I think you're spot on. To deal with the first issue about like the timing and how complicated and difficult these options are, the reason why I was a little bit more cynical and critical of the put it in a museum option is I think every monument actually has like, you have to deal with it on its own. There's not going to be a writ large solution to monument, like all Confederate monuments. There are some monuments called Confederate monuments because they're just representing POW soldiers or soldiers of the dead. And they're more complicated for people. So it's not Robert E. Lee, it's not slave owners, it's like just all soldiers who died. And so people have much more complicated histories or positions on that. So I think I was just being too general and cynical in that moment. But I also saw it's been a habit, especially when you're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, along with these monumental debates, is that a lot of city governments said, okay, this is an issue, we have to remove it from public. And then after a couple of years, just released it. And so they would put it in a different public location without any community input. Or when it came to the museums, I'm not opposed to like, yeah, certain things belong in the museums and you can learn more. But I also want to hear those folks that, especially in like Virginia, where there's a Confederate museum, what does it mean just to put a Confederate monument in a Confederate museum where people go to buy stuff and celebrate that history? Like that's when I think it gets much more complicated, especially in the United States where like there's only one museum to slavery in the entire country. So like when I mean slavery, just with the EJI, like the perspective is actually like talking about the numbers, talking about the places, actually creating monuments for the enslaved. I think that's very different from like in Baltimore, there's a monument to enslaved people that represents like Baltimore's slave trade as a slave port. But there's not a huge museum that deals with what they call it as a reckoning, like actually reckoning with this historical fact and its present day legacy. So for me, I think I was being too cynical where I think some monuments can go in a museum and it wouldn't be actually problematic or an issue. It could be educational. So yes, with the encounters model, to answer your second part, because these are such complicated issues, the reason why I said one takeaway is rinse and repeat is that I want people to like, there are multiple encounters model. You can always have the slides and go through it yourself. We provide the readings freely. but it's about engaging with the community member. So like if you're going to encounters about monuments now, what monuments do you actually have in the locations you live in? Trying to get people interested in these questions in their actual social environment, that's more like what I'm engaged with at the facilitation level. Like, this can lead to conflict or has already led to conflict. Do you want to know more? Do you want to know why monuments matter? Do you know the debate, the history, the violence that can happen? Let's actually start caring about it, and then just making other tools that aren't encounters, that aren't by me. They're like, there are people like mutual aid funds. There are people that do protest, that people are more activist based. That's not the encounters model, but saying like, let's engage here at least first to give you more resources to know what you want to do. But I firmly agree, yeah, very complicated. Is 7:00, is it okay to do one question or? Okay, just because
All question I want to ask previously, you mentioned the social structure, so I'm interested, have you considered expanding internationally to maybe collaborate and implement this type of dialogue in countries, conflict within countries, where specifically there were violence and conflicts were spurred due to the identity of ethnicity and nationality? Because in the country where I come from, North Macedonia, there were violent protests and conflicts most recently. On one side, people who were against building certain monuments related to the history of the country, and on the other side, very conservative, right-oriented people who think that that's part of their history and those monuments should be there. So that was really very complicated. Looking forward to hearing about that.
yeah, so where we're at just organizationally, we're more local and regional, and part of the Contested Histories Initiative project is pushing us like to actually go more national. So over the next 5 years, we're planning on not only doing more white papers, more information about like the meaning of monuments, the philosophy of monuments, but also having encounters in different locations across the United States to time up with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So like, that's a huge project I'm involved with. We do have some particularly European partners that are also like working with us on monuments. But I just think like in terms of organization and like money, we don't have the resources yet to do international. Like, we've talked to international partners about monuments, but not really about implementing encounters for monuments in other places, so.
So in many ways, in terms of just the context that I see the encounters model being used, and it seems like it's a vehicle of restorative justice. Or it can be a vehicle for restorative justice by at least bringing individuals together in a way that flattens power, flattens ideas of authority. And even just by opening up a space where where some people may find a particular opinion to be egregious, the opportunity to just come to the table and have someone, even if it's forced, to listen to it and ultimately to sort of like work through it, that it can become a process of restoration through just giving people the space to just see a different side or to think differently.
Yeah.
And
Sorry.
yeah, no, I mean, I was just thinking of that, and I'm really interested in that because I'm an archaeologist, and one of the things that we have, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about heritage and memory, which really comes down to this idea of, beautifully said, like whose past gets remembered, or what are the sort of overlapping stories that are oftentimes embedded in particular sites or in particular landmarks. And what I really like about the encounters model is that it really opens up a space to really make those stories, those overlapping stories, known and visible. Now, the next part though, of course, is how individuals, sort of act on it, which is also, I mean, it's not necessarily predator class, but it just seems that it can be a very important aspect of the restorative justice process in terms of how it opens up those new spaces, like you said.
Yeah, and it's not something about whose past gets remembered. For me, it's also a question of who past gets dismembered and restoring that. So there's definitely the way I've been using encounters for monuments, the restorative justice element. You can do these with high schoolers, younger children. You just change the like, what are we actually reading? So I've done encounters with high schoolers before, college students, community members. It's very adaptable. And when it comes to conflict resolution and restorative justice, the work I do is trying to make people see monuments as being actually enveloped and connected to political and social structures. And once you see them as representative of those power relationships, a contest about a monument is a contest also sometimes about like, hey, treaty rights. Like if you're talking about the Mount Rushmore, how can you not talk about indigenous sovereignty? How can you not talk about land back and treaty rights? The US has broken every single treaty it has with indigenous people. The question of a monument might be restoring of actual treaty relations. That might be an outcome I want people to actually envision and see. But the reason why I don't go fully there is just because I say, when we do our monument, like our encounters on alchemy, we're like, there's no restorative justice element there. It's just like pure interest. We're going to galleries. But yeah, definitely when it's more conflict based, that's how I envision the work. And it's 7:12, so I was like, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, like I said, next time I'll use my laptop. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone online as well. Hopping between a PDF, a PowerPoint.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's like again, this is no one's computer.
No.
Thank you.
Going to stop the recording.
Yes.